This morning I'm pleased to welcome to the program author Mervyn Taylor, whose latest work, The Last Train, according to Miss Debbie Jacob, is a metaphor for the author's early travels. Now, this collection of poetry is available for purchase at the paper-based Normandy Hotel. That's the bookstore at Normandy Hotel. And Mr. Taylor is with us via Zoom this morning. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing well. How are you doing?
Not too bad at all.
Well,
I just want to mention that besides paper-based, it's also available at Metropolitan Books on Arpita Avenue.
Oh, excellent. That makes it easier for me to get a copy.
There you go.
But Mr. Taylor, thank you very much for joining me. I start the conversation. The book speaks very much of you as a young man growing up in Belmont with your family, but also speaks about your travels to the United States, particularly Brooklyn. Those travels, was that the setting, the inspiration behind this book, The Last Train, which, according to Debbie Jacob, is a metaphor for that period in your life?
I don't know if the travels, I think this is just the culmination of a lot of books that explore my relationship, in other words, between life in America and life in Trinidad. You know, I'm always back and forth straddling the two places at the same time. So The Last Train really is a continuation of my former books. I have 7 books that came before this one. And basically, they pretty much keep exploring sort of the same theme, you know, how the immigrant takes his country with him wherever he goes, you know, and that's true for me too.
Now, are you an immigrant of old Trinidad, given that Trinidad has evolved, society has evolved? Would you describe yourself as an immigrant of sweet old Trinidad and Tobago? Or are you very much still in touch with how society has evolved? Have you yourself evolved with society?
Well, I think so. I come home, I try to come home as often as I could. And you notice I say home, right? As often as I could. And one cannot escape, you know, one's origins, right? Or not even try to. Case in point, during the recent pandemic, I was in Trinidad for that whole time for about almost 2 years. And some people say you were locked down. I didn't feel as if I was locked down. I was in the house where I grew up, basically in Belmont, and just getting back in touch with all the things that made me who I am, you know, all my formative years. I actually was sleeping in the same room where my father passed away, and a lot of memories, a lot of things triggered during that period. And actually, it was inspirational because I ended up writing some new poems which were published called the Corona Poems, a book called News of the Living. And they all came to me while I was there in Trinidad, almost daily, almost every morning I would write something new, something concerning the pandemic, but also something concerning my return to that place, you know, the place that made me, I guess, who I am.
Well, you also mentioned your father, and you've suggested that in your poems about your father, you keep trying to hear what he didn't say. Is that something that is extremely difficult to put to paper when you have all these thoughts and emotions going through your head, especially with memories of your father? The difficulty in trying to translate such thoughts and emotions to paper, is that in itself, would you describe that a journey, an emotional journey?
Yes, it is. You know, the language, of course, is the tool, right, that takes us through whatever exploration we're doing. It is through language that we can examine our past, through language we can examine our present-day life. And going back, I think of my father, and his job is a perfect metaphor, right? He was a conductor on the Trinidad Railway. And so many things connected with that job. I remember I used to, when my mother and I would go down to take him his lunch, that I would beg him to ride with him, and I would go with him to Sandy Grande and spend the day with him at the depot in Sandy Grande. So a lot of what I remember my father being very meticulous about his uniform, about his cap, and how he would polish the buttons on his jacket. And so all these things combine, and not the least of which is the fact that he lost a part of his thumb while working on the train. He wasn't an engineer, so I don't know what he was doing, trying to fix the coupling between carriages, but this is how he lost a piece of his thumb. And that stays very much with me as a trigger for a man connected to his job. My father was very serious about work. I keep going back to that idea that he didn't say much, but that he knew what his life was to be about. And so he connected to work and to, after he retired, to the minding of his goats. He was very serious about that. I remember the children used to tease me about my father bringing home the goats, and the goats would be pretty much dragging him down the street. He would have about 6 or 7 of them on a rope, and my father holding up his pants with one hand and holding the rope for the goats with the other hand, And of course, that was not a good image for a young boy growing up. But in later years, I became very proud of his dedication to what he was doing, I remember him sitting in the yard. One of the young kids had gotten an infection in the stomach. And I remember my father sitting on a bench and very patiently cleaning the worms from the stomach of this young kid, And that's an image of him that just sustains me in a way, Again, here's a man who didn't say much, but who, when I think of him, his actions said a lot, And
Mr. Taylor, how do you actually, given such experiences and such memories, how do you juxtapose the positive side of life, the one full of sunny days, bright days, versus the more negative side of life in your poetry? How do you present the difference between a bright sunny day and a negative day?
The brights are bright. Well, they're all days, right? We have to accept them as they come, right? We have bright days and we have sunny. We have no control sometimes over what color the day assumes, but it is part of life. And I remember a story once about a man who ran away from Europe, and while his wife and children were being held hostage, And in the interview, he smiled, and the reporter said, "How can you smile having such terror in your life, such a terrible thing to think about?" And he said, "Well, I'm alive, and the fact that I'm able to talk about it gives me some measure of joy." So there's that. And when I re-examine, or when I go back to the past, this is not, people use the word nostalgia. This is not nostalgia. I think I examine the past to find out things that I didn't notice before. And all of literature is really an examination of the past, right? That we go back to see if we missed something, if there was something there that was more important than we realized,
Mm-hmm. Well, such tragedy, I suppose, is something that we experience every day. But furthermore, if I were to go back to your travels as a young man to the United States, did that create new perspectives of Trinidad and Tobago society as it was then, or did it create a greater appreciation for Trinidad and Tobago society?
Both, I think, when you leave home, you bring, again, as I said, you bring everything with you. Trinidad is a glorious place, in spite of travails, in spite of trouble like anywhere else in the world. And hopefully we can get a grip on what is happening now. Part of it is that I think of what I brought with me, the Trinidad that I brought with me and the Trinidad that I come home to visit now. And I note some of the differences, you know. And it is true of people anywhere in the world, right? That they go back to what they know best, but also they use it as the equipment with which they face the future. I think when I grew up in Belmont, you know, we used to, our heroes were the so-called bad guys, right? What you call Bajons in those days. But in those days, the Bajons were protective of the community. They looked after the community. Nobody could come in and threaten people or threaten the old folks and so on. Now that gangster guy is a different animal, right? These are the ones that are actually preying upon society in a way. So life changes, but the past somehow can arm us with what we need to face the future. We can. I remember and again, early in the interview, I talked to Debbie Jacob about this, about an old Indian man, Arjun, and there's a poem called Arjun's Prediction, who actually told my mother that she would have a son. And I thought, my mother was supposed to be past her childbearing years. She was in her early 40s at the time. But he predicted my birth almost to the day. And I grew up, and this man actually lived with us. He lived under our house. We didn't really have a high house, but the back was higher than the front. And he actually lived with us for many, many years, actually until he left and died shortly after. But my whole life, I knew Arjun, this man. And he was like not a father figure, but sort of a spiritual guide for me, you know. When my dog got impounded, he was the one who went and paid the money to take him out of the pound, you know. When I needed thread to fly a kite in the savannah, he's the one who went and got me the biggest reel of thread I've ever seen, you know. So part of those are the things that I think I hold to and rediscover each time. And I see them in a new light when I go back, when I write about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've certainly had many figures in your life that you've remembered, and that has been the inspiration for your poems. But you've also said that when you worked at Columbia University, you worked with Joseph Brodsky and Derek Walcott. You even admitted to Mr. Walcott that at one time you were considering becoming a novelist, writing fiction. His response to you was to refer to you as a traitor.
Yeah, he said, you know, poets don't turn to fiction, you know, that he saw poetry really as a sort of higher calling. And his idea was that what follows naturally from poetry is the play. And that if a poet wanted to move on into another arena, it should be the business of writing plays, not writing novels, you know. I have nothing against novelists. Actually, while I was a boy at St. Mary's, I just loved creating stories and writing essays and so on. I think that's where my first love for writing came. And so the short story or the novel was always the ambition. You know, poetry seemed just another, like a really foreign field, you know. But after I came to this country and spent some time at Howard University, I had teachers who were inspirational. Sterling Brown was one of the poets who taught me at that time. There's a teacher named John Lovell. And I think I discovered poetry like during the Black Power days. You know, Stokely Carmichael had just left Howard. And so I picked up on poetry as a vehicle. And it continued through my sojourn, my time in New York. And I met people with similar interests. I was part of a group called the Bud Jones Poets. And again, as life goes on, we have all these people who come in and out of doors, you know. One of our members, Wesley Brown, went to prison for refusing to the draft, refusing to go to Vietnam. And so our group, we were supportive of each other. And yeah, what Walcott said might be true, but I think the art leads you where it wants to. And from poetry, again, he may have been right about the play, and I've had some things in the back of my mind. I haven't gotten to them yet, but that was one of his issues. And Derek's plays really teach you so much. And again, I know what he meant, that the play had the language of the poem, right? That if you examine Shakespeare's plays, their poetry, their verse, really.
Yes, yeah. Well, Mr. Taylor, something that you just mentioned, that you had that support group. You mentioned a colleague who was drafted and he refused to go to Vietnam. And your group acted as a support to one another. In your experience as a young man, a young Trinbagonian, growing up in Belmont and witnessing what Trinidad and Tobago was versus what it is today, and even in your time spent in Brooklyn, would you suggest, is it accurate to suggest that there is more camaraderie between West Indians outside the diaspora, outside of the Caribbean?
That's a difficult question. I don't know if there's more camaraderie, but I think people in a foreign country tend to cling to each other, right? To recognize each other. I remember once I was in Singapore, just traveling, and I remember coming off a boat and hearing a voice on the jetty, and I recognized it immediately as the voice of a countryman, you know, and we greeted each other as if we had known each other for many years. Of course, I didn't know who he was, but when you meet a person from your land who speaks your language, it's just the most amazing thing, right? And here in Brooklyn, where I am, right next to Prospect Park, I mean, that's every day. I mean, I walk out the street, it's almost like being on Frederick Street sometime. Woodruff Street right next to me here. There's a posse on the corner there. It's like Frederick and Queen all over again.
Now, you've described yourself as an avid masquerader. You've also been part of the Juve scene in Brooklyn for many years. You said that you try to never miss passing on the grandstand here, the grand stage of Carnival here in the Savannah. But you've also said that in today's Carnival, the mass is missing the narrative. What do you mean by that?
I mean, Carnival, when I was growing up, that most of the bands famous at that time, George Bailey or Harold Saldina and so on, the mass pretty much always told a story. That you had characters and you had people coming on stage, even the war mass from the steel bands, right? You would all Back to Bataan or to Hell and Back and so on. And pretty much we got a lot of our ideas from movies, right? But these bands always had a narrative. In other words, coming onto the stage in the Savannah, that they always be presenting some aspect of a story, something to do with a moment in time, right? Present day bands really come on and there's not much of a story. I mean, the band may have a name and the masqueraders come on and of course they're joyous and it's part of a celebration, but there's no story. They're just people who come on and having a good time and jumping and so on. So the spectator is robbed of the idea of how this all fits together. What is the reason for this mass, in other words? Not that you always have to have a reason, but it helps if there's some meaning to what you're doing, right? If I remember Valmont Jones as Nero on Cheltenham Avenue. And I remember the whole drama of him walking towards the Savannah with about 50 yards of cape behind him and so on. And so there was always a story. When George Bailey presented Relics of Egypt, for example, you know, that you had a tale being told almost all the time. And it made a difference, right, to the spectator looking on, you know. They would notice certain things going on in the band and look at this, look at that, you know. Now, yeah, there is spectacle, but almost spectacle without any kind of a guiding storyline.
And would you say that in itself is what society has become? We are not entirely sure of our own story, or we're not entirely sure of our own narrative. We don't even know where we're going. Is Carnival and today's mass very much in part with how society is here in Trinidad and Tobago.
That's a very good point you're making there. Yeah, it could be, right, that we don't have some guiding principle, and I think part of what a society is it's made up of heroes, it's made up of leaders, it's made up of ideas, and I think going back to the past, it's not a matter of nostalgia. It's a matter of finding our heroes, identifying them, and finding models for who we are. In other words, if we have models to follow or build upon, not foreign models so much, not to say we look outside for heroes, but heroes among ourselves. And I think part of what I look for when I write about these people who were in my life is to pull out the heroic in them. And so to create models that the average person in Trinidad or the young man in Trinidad could look at and say, oh, I could become that. I'll give you a quick example. We live next door to a man named Mr. Marshall. And Mr. Marshall worked as a law clerk in Port of Spain. But he had ambition, right? He wanted to be a lawyer, but he didn't have the wherewithal to go abroad to study. And I remember him making a decision. I was just a boy then, but I remember this big guy making a decision to stay home and study law. In other words, doing law by correspondence, which, as you can imagine, is not an easy thing, right? Mm-hmm. And this man, he quit his job and he stayed home and just studied. Studied every day. I remember him in the morning, like about 5 a.m, you would hear him huffing and puffing. He was doing his shadow boxing exercises before he got down to the books. And he did this assiduously for years. And then I remember him going and taking the exam, the bar exam. And I remember waiting anxiously, right? Everybody in the lane is waiting for him to come home so we could celebrate and say. And what happened is that he fainted during the course of the examination. All that anxiety and the heat and everything else, he fainted. And I remember him, and I'm saying to myself, he must be ready to give up. But he didn't. He came home, and I can tell you, like, it's almost like the next day, the morning after, he began studying again. Because that exam was only given once a year. So he began studying again for the next year. And the next year, he aced that test, and he became a lawyer. And
sometimes you wonder if that determination will still exist within individuals today, whether or not they're actually willing to get up and go for it. But so we're almost... Sorry.
I think we must wake it up, right? We must encourage it. If it's there in every human being has a spark to do something worthwhile, not to kill somebody, but to do something worthwhile. And it must be recognized, it must be built, Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, if nothing else, I think my poems, I keep looking for that all the time and to encourage it,
Well, we're almost out of time, but why share these poems, which have very deep personal meaning to you and speaks about your experiences, even the experiences of your father? Why share this poem with the rest of the world, these poems, with the rest of the world?
Because how else would we recognize each other, right? Here comes Debbie Jacob all the way from Ohio, and who's doing just this incredible work here in our society in Trinidad, right? Who goes into the prisons, who sees hope among these young men, who's inspired actually by these young men who are incarcerated. I don't know how many people know it, but Debbie Jacob got men in Frederick Street prison to build a library in what used to be death row, because we don't have the death penalty anymore. And she encouraged these young men, and they built a library in the prison. She's created a debating team in the prison that can argue with boys from QRC or from anywhere in the world. They can hold their own you see. And she yesterday I read something from her about a young man in that very prison who was on remand. I think it was in the newspaper. He was in remand yard for like 15 years. And his case, I don't know if it was ever called, but they found out that he wasn't guilty of whatever it was. And she said this young man was never disillusioned. He never lost faith. When she would come in there and be down, he was the one who would keep her spirits up and keep the spirits of the rest of the prisoners up. There's something to be said for that, you know. Debbie Jacob brought barbers in to give these young men skills that when they came out of prison, they would not be a liability. She deserves all the praise. I mean, I'm encouraged by her strength. I did a couple workshops with her up at Golden Grove Prison also back in the days, but she has kept going and she's still going, and she's not discouraged at all. You know, it's amazing, and my hat off to her, and I'm so glad that she and I got to collaborate on this effort.
Well, certainly, as we conclude, Mr. Taylor, and I want to thank you very much for this interview. I mean, it's actually gone on further than I expected, but I'm most grateful for the conversation, and I know that many watching in our audience are appreciative of you juxtaposing society back then to what it is today. And I will actually close our conversation with a quote by Miss Jacob upon reviewing your poetry. She says, "This is what I love about Taylor's poems. They make ordinary desires and hopes extraordinary, and in so doing, make life and ordinary people special too." Well, Mr. Taylor, I look forward to reading more of your poems, and thank you very much for this conversation, and congratulations on your production.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.